Alright guys, y'all are going to get me for one more lesson here, and this lesson is going to be about the movement of matter. And so unfortunately this is probably not the most exciting of lessons because we're talking about cycles, these biogeochemical cycles, but it's definitely something that is ecologically important and something that is a big part of humans and how we impact them. And in environmental science, this is one of the many ways where we show how humans pretty much can mess things up in these natural systems. So the last lesson was all about energy, and we saw that energy is constantly being transferred and transformed from organisms to environment and environment to organisms, and we know that that energy can be transformed from one form to another, like in photosynthesis or cellular respiration. Well, matter, which is pretty much all the other stuff, remember that matter is anything that has mass and takes up space. So this is going to be like your solids, your liquids, your gases, your land, your air, your water. But matter is also going to be something that is constantly being exchanged and moved around within our ecosystems. So we have to have matter like water and minerals and nutrients from our food in order to build our bodies, build those macromolecules that we need, and just to essentially, stay alive. So matter is going to be recycled through these processes known as biogeochemical cycles. And where energy was kind of like a one-way flow, and energy can actually leave the biosphere, this matter is contained within our biosphere, and it's just constantly being transformed, but it's not a one-way flow necessarily like energy was. And so the reason we call them the biogeochemical cycles is because they involve bio or life processes, geo or earth processes, and of course chemical processes. And so this matter is constantly being exchanged in different ways by flows, which are processes that are moving this matter from one place to another or converting this matter from one form to another. And then where the matter is stored is in something called a pool. And that pool could be an organism, that pool could be a body of water, that pool could be the earth. And then a lot of times we call these pools either a sink, like there could be a carbon sink, or it could be a reservoir. And so pools, sinks, and reservoirs are all just essentially things that store the matter, and then the flows are the processes that move that matter or change that matter. And so the first cycle that we're going to talk about is the hydrologic cycle, more commonly known as the water cycle. And so water, we know, is essential to life. The majority of our bodies are water. We're pretty much giant solutions, and we have this medium for our chemical reactions and metabolism. Water is going to also dissolve and remove toxic materials, both inside of us and in our ecosystems. And so the water cycle is something that you guys have been doing since probably elementary school. And so I have a feeling that most of these terms are not new to you. But water is going to be constantly moving between the large bodies of water, the atmosphere, and the land. And so here we have a list of processes. Most of them, like I said, should be familiar, like evaporation, condensation, precipitation. One that I think is especially important as a biology teacher is transpiration. And so if you don't know what that is, you might want to jot it down, but transpiration is when water evaporates from the leaves of plants. And so actually quite a large amount of water can leave through plants. And so sometimes these are joined together for evapotranspiration, because both of these are going to be the loss of water or that transformation of water from a liquid to a gas form. Of course, then it can condense in the atmosphere as it cools, and then it can come back down in different forms of precipitation. Now, once that precipitation falls and it hits the earth, it can run off. It can collect into bodies of water. It could also percolate, which is where it moves downward through the soil and rock, and it can be stored deep underground as groundwater. And so the water cycle is relatively circular in terms of its cycle. We pretty much have those basic processes: evaporation, condensation, precipitation, repeat. It's a relatively pretty cycle, I think, in comparison to some of the other ones that we're going to look at. Now, in every cycle, we're going to talk about how do we as humans essentially mess it up, or how do we negatively impact that cycle. And it very rarely is a positive impact. Almost every time we are having negative impacts on our environment. And so many of these things are issues that we need to really put some focus into. These things are constantly being addressed in the news, and really it's something we should be conscious of. So when it comes to the water cycle, one big thing we can do is when we cut down large forests and we develop land, because essentially we're altering the water cycle in an area when we do that. By cutting down large numbers of trees, we're reducing that evapotranspiration. Also by removing plant material that increases erosion and could cause more flooding to occur. Anytime we cut down trees and turn land into parking lots and pavement, it reduces the ability of water to flow back down into the ground and be stored as groundwater. When we develop properties and land and build, often we divert natural water flows. We tend to overuse groundwater. We use and use and use and use without really thinking about the amount that we're using. And if we pump out too much groundwater, it can actually cause something called land subsidence, where it sinks in. Another thing we can do is we can affect the water quality through pollutants. And we have a whole section on pollution later on in the year. But pollution definitely can have some drastic effects, not only on us, but other organisms that live in an ecosystem. And so one way we contribute to water pollution is through actually burning fossil fuels. When we burn those fossil fuels, these chemicals like sulfur and nitrogen oxides, they go up into the air, they react with water, and they come back down in the form of acid precipitation, which can obviously affect the pH of water bodies. It can affect rocks and statues and things like that. Another important impact of pollution is something known as biological magnification. And this has to do with our food chains. And so what happens is that when these toxins get into bodies of water, the really small organisms, plankton, things like that, they actually incorporate these toxins into their bodies. And the problem is many of these toxins cannot easily be broken down naturally. And so as they pass through the food chains, they actually become more and more and more concentrated because they're not being broken down. And so what we see is a lot of times the presence of this pollution is not seen until you get into the upper levels of the food chains. And what happens is you start to see fish dying, you start to see predatory birds dying, and it's because if you look at these concentrations, this is DDT. This was a pesticide that used to be used. It may still be, but I think there were a lot of laws against it. And so you can see that what's happening to these parts per million is they're increasing considerably, which means there's a lot higher of a concentration of those toxins in that organism, to the point where it becomes deadly and it starts to affect the lives of those organisms. In terms of acid rain, one issue with it is that it normally doesn't affect the location where that pollution is being released into the air. It normally travels like downwind and causes some acid precipitation in nearby areas. All right, the next cycle we're going to take a look at is the carbon cycle. And carbon is an essential element to life. Carbon is the backbone for all of our organic compounds. And you may remember these terms from biology. We have our carbohydrates, our lipids, our proteins, and our nucleic acids. So these are what we call organic compounds. They have carbon, they're living, and they make up about 20%. Well, these compounds make up living things, but carbon makes up about 20% of an organism's body. Some other places that we can find carbon is in the form of calcium carbonate. We'll see that in animal skeletons, like coral reefs. And then we also see it in that carbon dioxide gas form, both in the air and water. And so there are 7 main processes that are going to kind of occur in the carbon cycle. These first 2 we actually talked about in the energy lesson, because both of these are reactions that are making energy in some form. So remember that photosynthesis takes in carbon dioxide and it takes in water, and with the help of light, it turns that carbon dioxide into those organic compounds or those sugars like glucose. And that's essential for food production in ecosystems. Now, respiration is essentially the opposite. What respiration does is it takes those compounds, the sugars, and it breaks them down in the presence of oxygen to get energy, and it actually releases carbon dioxide. So these two are the exact opposite, where one is storing carbon, the other is releasing carbon. Now, another life process is decomposition. It also is going to release some carbon dioxide. We see exchange, which this is when carbon dioxide is being exchanged between the atmosphere and water. Those calcium carbonate skeletons can precipitate out and form sediments in bodies of water. The sediments can accumulate and be buried over time, and over long periods of time, they can form those fossil fuels that are a big part of carbon and carbon balance and carbon cycle. And then we as humans are going to extract those fossil fuels and then burn them. And so all of these are going to be important components. So here's your basic carbon cycle. It's not quite as pretty as the water cycle. It's a bit more, I guess, scattered. You see a lot more arrows. It's not necessarily circular because there's many different ways that carbon can be exchanged and moved around in our environments. And so really the big takeaway, because a lot of times when we talk about carbon, we focus on the carbon dioxide. When we get into issues like global warming, it really has to do with the amount of carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, up in the atmosphere. And so kind of to me, an important way to look at the carbon cycle is, number one, how are we decreasing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and water? And number two, how are we increasing carbon dioxide in the air and water? And so the processes are kind of listed here. Are listed here. And so photosynthesis is a really important one. That's going to be one of those life processes, the bio part of the cycle. And so photosynthesis, remember, is going to take the carbon and turn it into organic compounds, which becomes incorporated into the body of the plant, which then passes through food chains and is incorporated into our bodies. We have the deposition and burial. This is an earth process, a geo process that's going to kind of store that carbon in rock. Of course, the fossil fuels form over long periods of time, and then we have the formation of those animal skeletons that store that calcium carbonate. And so the opposite are going to be these processes. Respiration and decomposition are going to release CO2. Now these are normal, natural amounts, okay? There's no problem. We can't really control the fact that we respire and release CO2. We can contribute to erosion and how much of that is occurring, because erosion can release CO2. We really don't have much of an effect over volcanoes, but we definitely have an effect over these two, the burning of fossil fuels and deforestation, which this is where we start to kind of get out of balance. And so the human impact, we definitely kind of alter the steadiness of the carbon cycle. If we were taken out of it and our burning of fossil fuels was removed, the carbon exchange would be relatively steady. We wouldn't have any major changes in the amounts that are going in and out of the environment, air, land. It would be relatively steady. And so the problem, and one of the issues, is that when we burn the fossil fuels, it causes an excessive amount of carbon dioxide. So like I said, we can't really control the fact that we respire and decompose, but we can control how much fossil fuels we are burning and releasing the amount of carbon dioxide that we are into the atmosphere. And so this is the kind of one of the big contributors to global warming, is that it's outside of that natural cycle. We are increasing them beyond the natural fluctuations. And so on top of that, we also cut down lots of trees. Well, trees are carbon sinks. Plants store the carbon. They turn that CO2 into organic compounds. And so if we greatly reduce the vegetation in an area, we're going to greatly reduce the carbon that's stored in plants, which means more is going to be in the atmosphere. All right, our next cycle is going to be the nitrogen cycle. And the nitrogen cycle is another very important one because nitrogen is often considered a limiting nutrient. So in the energy lesson, we talked about primary production. Well, in order for producers to produce, they have to have certain nutrients, and nitrogen is going to be one of those. Now, the thing with nitrogen is that it's actually very abundant. In the form of nitrogen gas, or N2, it makes up the majority of our atmosphere. But the problem with nitrogen is it's not usable by living things. We can't breathe in nitrogen gas and use it to make amino acids, or use it and put it in our DNA and RNA. So this form, while very abundant, is not useful to us. We cannot use it in that form. And so in order for nitrogen to be usable by living things, it has to be turned into compounds, things like these here, ammonia and ammonium, nitrates and nitrites. And so these are the things that we find in organisms. These are the compounds that get incorporated in our bodies to help us make proteins and nucleic acids. They can be found in waste products. They can be found in fertilizers. And so once again, we have some important processes that occur as this form of matter gets exchanged and transformed. Now, probably one of the most notable processes of the nitrogen cycle is nitrogen fixation. So remember, the abundant form, nitrogen gas, is not usable. It's not usable by plants, it's not usable by animals, it's not usable by really any living thing in terms of using it to become part of our bodies. And so nitrogen fixation is the process that makes it usable. Okay, it's the process that takes that nitrogen gas and it turns it into a usable form. And we're going to talk more about that here in just a second. Now, another process is nitrification. So oftentimes nitrogen fixation turns it into ammonia or ammonium, and then it gets converted into these nitrites and nitrates. And so that's just a nitrogen conversion from one compound to another. Assimilation is when it's taken in by the plants. And then mineralization is when organisms are decomposed and they return those nitrogen compounds back to the soil. And then denitrification is essentially the opposite of nitrogen fixation. This is where the compounds get converted back to a gas. And so here we have the unusable nitrogen that's in the atmosphere in the gas form. We have a very special group of bacteria that can fix it and turn it into a usable form. Then it can be converted into other nitrogen compounds. Decomposers can return these compounds to the soil. Plants are going to take them in from the soil. And then how we get it is just through those basic food chains. So the plants get the nitrogen compounds from the soil, and then everything else gets it by eating the plants or eating something that ate a plant. And then, of course, we have that opposite process known as denitrification that turns it back into a gas. And this isn't necessarily a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 kind of cycle. And I don't know if you're going to do this activity or not with Mr. Womack being out, but there's a nitrogen cycle activity where you visit all of the different stations. And sometimes you get stuck in a loop. You end up going back to the same places over and over again because you don't necessarily go in a particular order. It's just there's many different processes that could transform you. And so a little bit more on that important process of nitrogen fixation. Number one, this is a living process. This is one of those bio things, and that's because it involves bacteria. Now, not all bacteria have the ability to do this. The ones that can, we call them nitrogen-fixing bacteria. There's a special group. A lot of them are in the genus Rhizobium. They live in the soils. Some of them live in the root nodules of legumes, and this word right here, I think it's a fun word to say, but your legumes are bean plants, things like soybeans and clover and peanuts. And so these bacteria are special and essential to ecosystems because they have the ability to make that nitrogen gas usable. So they turn the gas into ammonia, and then later on that can be converted into ammonium, which then can be converted into nitrites and nitrates. And so this is essentially one of the most important processes because this is how we get usable nitrogen for living things. Now, the bacteria are not the only way that it can be fixed. There's some abiotic processes through lightning, fires, combustion. Those could also cause nitrogen to be fixed into nitrate, which once again makes it usable to the plants. And so, as always, how do we affect this cycle? Now, this may not seem like that big of a deal, but I think it's something that if we were to experience it more in our everyday lives, we would see the impact. But, you know, this is probably something that unless you're a farmer or unless you are kind of reliant on fishing and things like that, you may not really experience the negative impact in our daily lives going just to school and work like we do. But essentially it comes down to using synthetic fertilizers. So fertilizers essentially contain those nitrites and nitrates, and that's what we need to help our plants grow. Remember that nitrogen can be a limiting nutrient. And so what we do is we take our factories and we create these synthetic fertilizers. this isn't the same thing as using like compost, or this isn't the same thing as using manure to fertilize your garden, okay? We're talking about man-made, synthetic, pretty much fake fertilizers that are not naturally formed. And so what happens is when we put these on large stretches of land, number one, they can leach out, which is where these chemicals move through the soil with water, and a lot of times they travel to places where they don't need to be, okay? They don't necessarily stay on the fields. They end up leaching and moving into bodies of water and potentially causing what's called an algal bloom. Now that may not sound like that big of a deal, that algae overgrows, but algal blooms could essentially destroy like a pond ecosystem, because what happens is the algae just grow out of control. They can grow to the point where they block sunlight, which is going to affect production in that ecosystem. They overgrow to where they can't be supported, and they actually start to pull oxygen from the water. Well, all the other living things that need oxygen are going to suffer. And so algal blooms can be very detrimental to any kind of water ecosystem. Now, another problem is that the excess use of nitrogen fertilizers can increase the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere, which is just going to affect that overall balance of the nitrogen cycle in some areas. All right, the last cycle that we're going to talk about is the phosphorus cycle. And this one to me is really kind of the least exciting. There's not a lot going on with the phosphorus cycle, but phosphorus is an essential nutrient. We need phosphorus to build our DNA and RNA, and it's in our ATP molecules. We also see phosphorus in our phospholipids, which makes up our cell membranes. So a lot of our big macromolecules also contain phosphorus. And so it is also, along with nitrogen, considered to be a limiting nutrient. And so when we make fertilizers, oftentimes they contain both nitrates and phosphates. And so phosphorus is kind of a boring compound. Phosphorus, for the most part, you're going to find in the form of phosphate, which is what we see down here. Phosphorus with some oxygens. And this is what we call inorganic phosphate. There is no gas phase, and so for the most part, your phosphorus is just going to be found in soils and rock. And so assimilation, once again, we saw that back in the nitrogen cycle, but this is when plants kind of bring it in and make it part of their tissues, and they turn that inorganic phosphate and attach it to other things, and it becomes organic phosphorus, which is part of a living thing. And then the mineralization, once again, is where decomposers can return it. When living things die and decay, those nutrients will go back into the soil in the form of inorganic phosphate. Water doesn't really dissolve. Phosphorus doesn't really dissolve in water. And so what happens is it precipitates out. Because it's in the soil and rock, geologic processes can expose it, and then weathering and erosion can allow it to kind of be transferred into the land, the soil, and water bodies. So it's really kind of uneventful. There's not a whole lot going on. Pretty much it's in the soil, it gets transferred to plants, it passes through the food chains, and it gets put back into the soil or the water. But like all the other cycles, we do have an impact. A lot of times we mine phosphate, and anytime there's mining, there can be environmental impact. We can destroy land. That could lead to pollution. It could lead to increased erosion. It depends on the type of mines that they're using. But we can use these phosphate sediments to make fertilizers. We already know from the nitrogen cycle that these fertilizers could lead to leaching and overgrowth of algae. And then also phosphorus was used in laundry detergents, and what they were finding is that when that water ran off and they got into these ecosystems, the phosphorus was causing some problems like with algae growth and things like that. So there has been a ban on using those in certain detergents since about 2010. And that is going to wrap up the second lesson that I'm doing for you guys, the movement of matter. So really you've got energy that is transferred and transformed in different ways. It's absolutely essential to living ecosystems. And now we have how matter can be moved and transferred and transformed in different ways, also essential to our environments. And so I hope you guys are having a great year. I'd love to hear from you. If you ever have any problems, or if you have any good things to share, I will be around here and there for some of the other dual credit classes, probably more than you guys, but I'm always here if you need me, and I hope you all have a great day.